Here's how it all started. On a bright Monday morning, Mark Reynolds boarded one of his own luxury airlines flights under the guise of an average businessman. Dressed in a simple suit, he carried nothing but a warm leather briefcase and a calm demeanor. Mark was not your typical CEO. He believed in running his airline not from a high-rise office, but from the ground, or in this case, the skies. Every so often, he would fly anonymously to experience firsthand what his passengers and employees went through. Today, however, he was about to witness something he hadn't expected. The flight was fully booked, and the bustling energy of the cabin filled the air. As Mark found his way to his economy seat near the back of the plane, he nodded politely to the flight attendants preparing for takeoff. They seemed professional enough at first glance, and Mark silently hoped this would be one of those smooth flights where everything just worked. But things quickly took an unexpected turn. "Sir, that bag needs to go up there," snapped a sharp voice. Mark looked up to see a flight attendant, a tall woman with a perfectly pressed uniform and a name tag that read Samantha. She didn't smile, didn't offer a helping hand, just pointed impatiently toward the overhead compartment. "Oh, of course," Mark said, lifting his briefcase without complaint. He wasn't expecting special treatment. He rarely ever did during these undercover trips. But there was something in Samantha's tone that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the lack of warmth. It was the subtle disdain, as though she had already judged him unworthy of her time. Mark sat down, brushing it off. Everyone had bad days, right? Maybe she was tired. But as the flight progressed, it became clear that Samantha wasn't having a bad day. She was having a bad attitude. The flight attendant seemed to divide the passengers into two categories: those she deemed worthy of her attention and those she didn't. If someone in first class so much as shifted in their seat, she rushed to them with a gleaming smile. But back in economy, where Mark was seated, her demeanor was entirely different. Requests for water were met with exaggerated sighs, and a mother struggling with her toddler received nothing more than an eye roll. When the food service began, Samantha stopped at Mark's row with barely concealed irritation. "Chicken or vegetarian?" she asked, not even looking at him. "Chicken, please," Mark replied calmly. She thrust the tray toward him without a word, her nails clicking against the plastic. Mark thanked her anyway, but she had already moved on, her polite smile reserved for the businessman in the aisle seat who was wearing an expensive watch. Mark watched silently, observing her behavior throughout the flight. It wasn't just about him. This was about the kind of experiences passengers were having on his airline. For someone who had built this company from the ground up with a focus on customer care, it was disheartening. He could feel his patience thinning, but he stayed quiet, letting the scene unfold. He wanted to see how far this would go. But then came the moment that changed everything. As the plane neared cruising altitude, Samantha passed by Mark's seat again. This time, a small error on his part sparked an interaction that would leave the entire cabin stunned. He had accidentally placed his coffee cup on the edge of the tray table, and as the plane jolted slightly, it spilled, a harmless mistake. "Oh, for crying out loud," Samantha muttered loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Can you not even handle a simple cup of coffee? Honestly, people like you shouldn't even be allowed to fly." Her words cut through the cabin like a knife. A few passengers gasped, others exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do. Mark's face remained calm, but inside he was anything but. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't mean to spill it." Samantha scoffed. "Well, maybe next time, pay a little more attention," she said, shaking her head as she stormed off to grab cleaning supplies. Passengers nearby whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the way she had handled the situation. Mark sat quietly, wiping his hands on a napkin, but his mind was racing. He knew he had seen enough. 7 minutes later, the flight attendant's world would turn upside down, and she had no idea it was coming. Mark sat quietly in his seat, staring at the tray table as though it held the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. The coffee spill might have been minor, but Samantha's reaction wasn't. It spoke volumes about her attitude, not just toward him, but toward anyone she deemed unimportant. Mark had spent years building his airline on a foundation of respect, customer service, and excellence. Seeing this behavior firsthand made him wonder how much of it went unnoticed or unreported. Passengers were still murmuring, some shooting glances at Samantha as she stomped up and down the aisle with exaggerated briskness. A young couple sitting across from Mark exchanged worried looks, their voices low but audible. "She was so rude to the lady with the baby earlier," the woman whispered. "I know," her partner replied. Imagine being stuck with someone like her on a long flight. Mark absorbed every word, his instincts sharpening. His airline was supposed to stand out in a competitive industry, known for treating passengers with care regardless of their seat or status. This wasn't just a bad day for Samantha, it was a bad look for his entire company. The in-flight service continued, but Mark noticed how Samantha's attitude remained icy in the economy cabin. When an elderly man politely asked for a blanket, she responded as though it were the most inconvenient request in the world. Meanwhile, her tone shifted entirely when she interacted with first-class passengers. She laughed at their jokes, leaned in conspiratorially as though they were old friends, and flashed a smile so wide it seemed almost rehearsed. Mark had always believed in leading by example, and it gnawed at him to sit back and let this unfold. But he needed to understand the full scope of the problem. Was Samantha an outlier, or was this attitude symptomatic of a deeper issue? He resolved to stay quiet for now and let the situation play out. As the flight moved into its cruising phase, Mark's thoughts wandered back to the origins of his airline. It hadn't been easy to build something from scratch. Years ago, when he first started the company, he had poured everything he had into creating an airline that valued people above profits. His vision wasn't just about getting passengers from one place to another. It was about creating an experience, an environment where every customer felt respected and cared for. He remembered the countless nights spent poring over every detail, from seat designs to meal plans. The most critical part, however, had always been the staff. Mark believed that a company was only as good as the people who represented it. That's why he had personally been involved in the hiring process during the early days, handpicking individuals who shared his vision for exceptional service. But as the company grew, he had to step back from the day-to-day operations and trust others to maintain the culture he had worked so hard to build. He had trained managers to uphold his values and implemented systems to ensure quality. Yet, moments like this made him wonder if something had been lost along the way. The airline had expanded rapidly in the last few years, opening new routes and hiring hundreds of new staff. Samantha was likely one of the more recent hires, but her behavior hinted at a larger problem. Was it poor training? A lack of accountability? Or was it something deeper, a cultural shift that had slipped through the cracks? Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the front of the cabin. A passenger in first class had apparently spilled wine on his shirt, and Samantha was rushing to his aid, practically tripping over herself to apologize and clean up the mess. Her voice was sweet and soothing, a stark contrast to the sharp tone she had used with Mark and others in economy. "Oh, no, sir, I'm so sorry about that. Let me get you a fresh napkin and another drink. On the house, of course," she said, her tone dripping with concern. Mark couldn't help but notice the disparity. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a complete transformation in her demeanor depending on who she was dealing with. It was clear that she prioritized passengers she thought could benefit her, or maybe those she thought she had to impress. He also noticed something else. While Samantha lavished attention on first-class passengers, the rest of the cabin crew seemed to pick up the slack in economy. A younger flight attendant named Claire, with a warm smile and a calm presence, quietly moved through the rows, helping passengers with their requests. She was the one who eventually brought Mark a replacement coffee, setting it down with a polite, "Here you go, sir. Sorry for the wait." Mark thanked her, genuinely appreciating the gesture. Claire's kindness stood out against the backdrop of Samantha's coldness, and it gave him hope that not everything was amiss. Still, Samantha's behavior had crossed a line, and Mark knew he couldn't ignore it. He had always believed that passengers shouldn't just pay for a ticket. They should feel like they were valued. It didn't matter if someone was sitting in first class or the last row of economy, every single passenger deserved respect. Mark discreetly pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll through emails. In reality, he was taking notes, documenting everything he had observed. He listed specific incidents, from the dismissive tone Samantha used with passengers to the way she had handled his coffee spill. These weren't just observations. They were data points he could use to address the situation later. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight crew prepared for the in-flight entertainment. Passengers settled into their seats, some pulling out headphones while others flipped through the onboard magazine. Mark's roommate, the businessman with the expensive watch, leaned over with a conspiratorial smile. "She's got quite the attitude, doesn't she?" he said quietly, nodding towards Samantha, who was now chatting animatedly with a first-class passenger. Mark nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "It's noticeable." The man chuckled. "I fly a lot, and let me tell you, she's one of the worst I've seen. Makes you wonder how someone like that keeps their job." Mark's lips tightened. It's something to think about. The comment stayed with him. How did someone like Samantha keep her job? Was it because no one had complained, or was it because her behavior only surfaced when she thought no one important was watching? Either way, Mark knew he would have to address it, not just for himself, but for the passengers and the integrity of his airline. As the plane continued its journey, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha's actions were a symptom of a larger issue. He had built this company to be different, to stand out in an industry where customer service often felt like an afterthought. But what he had witnessed today made him question whether his original vision was still intact. The tension in the cabin seemed to settle as the hours passed, but Mark's mind remained restless. He knew that once the plane landed, there would be no going back. Samantha had no idea who he was, but that would change soon enough. Mark glanced out the window at the clouds below, a determined look in his eyes. He didn't want to embarrass anyone or cause unnecessary conflict, but this wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about protecting the values he had worked so hard to build and ensuring that every passenger felt the difference his airline promised. For now, though, he stayed quiet, biding his time. 7 minutes had passed since the coffee spill, but Samantha had no idea her actions were under scrutiny. Mark leaned back in his seat, ready to let the rest of the flight unfold, knowing the real moment of reckoning was still ahead.